Hi everyone. Today we're joined by Nadia, a pioneer in modern workforces and work practices. Nadia is the founder of Remote Work Advocate, the go to place for companies embracing remote work and individuals willing to work flexibly. Nadia is also a founding member of the Remote First Institute, a not for profit on a mission to create a space with open source and expertise knowledge about remote first work approach. And Nadia is also the co founder of the Remote School, providing remote and hybrid work courses for professionals. So clearly, the right person to be speaking to us about the modern work practices and especially around everything around remote. Thank you for joining us, Nadia.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure. Super happy to be here.
Um, I want to focus specifically when we speak about remote work around contract workers and freelancer workers. I'm sure it's something that you see a lot and you deal a lot when you're working with companies and the market. What are some of the key things that you see companies getting wrong when hiring contractors? For example, misclassification issues.
I love the topic and I hate the topic. I hate the topic because it's really bad when it happens when we talk about misclassification. But then when I say I love it, it's just because it's the wild, wild west. So it's an endless ocean of opportunities to discover things I actually don't want to see. But it does happen at global scale. So many companies, from startup to well structured corporations, um, sometimes live in a really messy, I would say, surrounding in terms of contractor management and agreements. When does it kick in? The big trouble. Usually, it's when they're audited. Every business once in a while is audited in terms of social contributions. And then usually the auditors say, okay, so do you hire freelancers? Do you hire contractors? Show us the contracts, please. And then it turns out that there is provisions that shouldn't be there, right? Like, for example, paid time off, the name of the supervisor, who this person is supposed to report to, who is a contractor themselves, by the way, usually, right? Fixed pay as well, paying out the people, the contractors, the same way as employees within the payroll cycle, for example, right? There is also sick leave included in the contracts. There's also a fixed location, fixed working hours, and of course, performance reviews. As well, very often, and performance-based bonuses. So there are also performance-based bonuses, which is, well, clearly, well, something that speaks against a contractor relationship.
So this is becoming almost in a go-to advice of what you should not have in your contracts. But the reality is that more and more companies are going through this and hiring more contractors. I think even individuals want more flexibility, engaging with multiple companies. Um, and I think you started touching a bit on the contract side. But what are a few things that you think companies should establish with their contractors up front?
Well, from my perspective, what I can say in terms of the practices that I've observed, it's, oh, do you want to be a contractor? Do you want to be a freelancer? Great, let's sign this agreement. Does this person even have the right to be a contractor in their own country? Because in some countries, right, like in the US, you can be an independent contractor. There's nothing you need to do, just have a social security number. Whereas in some countries, like, I don't know, for example, Poland, right, you have to have your own business. Otherwise, you can't sign a contract like that. But nobody pays attention. Very often, these companies don't identify who's really on the other side, right? They just sign something with whomever, however, not even verifying anything. And then in addition to that, there comes, of course, the invoicing process. So from my perspective, when I assisted with hiring contractors, it's usually the question, do you want to work as a contractor? Yes, 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 no problem. And then this person is hired, and then after 1 month, that person doesn't get paid, and there is an issue. Why haven't I been paid? All the employees have been paid. I can't rely on this anymore. And I say, where's your invoice? What invoice? What do you mean by invoice? Right? So you have to issue an invoice. And here, what companies do, and they do it wrong, they very often have one invoice framework that they share with everyone with the logo on it, right? Well, you also can't do that. It's also something that isn't really good practice in terms of misclassification, and also very interesting to also know for individuals and for the company when to, for example, pay VAT it, together with an invoice amount. Why am I saying this? Because I think it was about 2 years ago when I worked with a company from the US and they had contractors in Mexico. And some of them were just invoicing, adding VAT, right? To the service for several months. And I actually audited the area. I mean, audited internally because that's what I was hired for, engaged for at that time. And then I said, hey, like, why have you been paying 20% on top, roughly, to every invoice? Because it's tax. I'm like, no, it should never be there in the first place. You don't pay that. So probably that person was super happy having extra money in their pocket, thinking that was tax, which is what not, which it wasn't, of course, right? So it's very important to know these things.
Yeah, those nuances, and I think it's super, and you mentioned super specific country by country. So someone being able to manage it globally, it's very very hard. Obviously, something that that can be solved, but a challenge for sure. You mentioned around benefits and pay time off, and folks at companies really wanting to treat everyone equal, but it shouldn't often be the case. Like, and it shouldn't be the case. What advice do you have for companies that who are used to employing full time employees, but are now engaging contractors regarding benefits and pay time off? How would you approach it?
Well, I think treating everyone equally doesn't mean treating everyone the same way. That's a huge difference, okay? It's a huge difference. And so when we have employees who are eligible for paid time off, in general, because it depends per country. In some countries, paid time off is actually considered an employee benefit, like, for example, in the US, right? Whereas in other countries, it's definitely not the case. But one thing is clear, you don't give that to contractors, okay? That is like, no matter which country, you don't do that in general, right? And here, there are some creative ways. By saying creative ways, I don't want to say that this is anything against the law, of course not, but it's a smart way to make sure that both sides, the contractor and the company, they understand the, so to say, rules of their collaboration up front. And so what I usually suggest is no fixed pay from that perspective, because then you can't also give a contractor paid time off. But what you can do is you can have either hourly rates or daily rates, and you can cap it. You can cap it on a monthly basis, you can cap it on a yearly basis. And this way, let's say we have the financial expectations of the contractor per month, and we say, okay, we will divide it by the number of days, right, within a year or within a month. And this is the maximum that you can invoice. But within that, if you invoice us every single day throughout the month or throughout the year, you will go over this cap about 15, 10, 20, depends whatever we want to give. You'll go over very quickly, right? So, in other words, in order not to reach the cap, you have to take unpaid leave. Just stop providing services for a few days. And this is how we usually do it. And that's the creative way. So these days are not being invoiced for, but in a way then this contractor understands, okay, like, I'm not invoicing, but at the end of the day, I mean, the end of the month or the end of the year, altogether, I feel like I'm being treated equally, but I'm not treated the same way as employees. Not to mention no sick leave, whatever, that is absolutely out of question in that case, right? So the number of days you can play around, depending on what you'd like to offer. But most importantly, this is actually unpaid leave, but also kind of the daily rates or the hourly rates are also competitive for the individual.
That connects perfectly to I think my last point, which is the expectation of these companies in terms of availability and specifically working hours of individuals and even location. Um, how have you been advising and working with companies around this? Because the nature of contractors obviously cannot restrict you on this, but I think expectations from both sides may be very different in these cases.
Absolutely. So, very correct. Of course, you don't put this in the contract, like fixed hours and a fixed location. No, that is employment almost right away. So, what you can do is obviously the business requirements, right? And the expectations from the service provider. Because at the end of the day, the individual, the contractor, is a service provider, right? Not an employee. And I had multiple situations where, for example, I had companies in Europe and they had contractors in South America saying, oh, you know what? I'm just not going to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning for a client call. So you're not doing your job. I'm sorry, right? So if you're a sales rep and you're just not going to do it, it's pointless for us to continue the business relationship. So I would have these expectations set up very clearly that the availability is determined due to this and that. For example, the clients getting in touch with, well, in that case, prospects, right? The availability of the client to conduct calls within this time zone, right? This is something that we can suggest as part of a mutual agreement, but it's not fixed in a sense of employment. So if there is anything in terms of the location and also in terms of the hours that would prevent the individual, the contractor, of actually providing their services, well, then it's justified, right? But it's not a relationship that I am actually acting as an employer and telling someone where to be just because I can do that, right? So the nature here is completely different.
Now, you touched before on the point of performance reviews being a no-no, but how are companies understanding if the work is being delivered and the performance of that contractor is all based on contract details? It may be a bit nuanced. How do you approach it?
Absolutely. So here again, it's all about expectations. So imagine that, well, all of us, right? We buy different services. We are either happy with the service or not. We get surveys that we respond to, right? So there is an option to evaluate the service, and that's exactly what it is. There should be a separate process which isn't a performance review by any means, but it's designed in a different way. So, what I always suggest is a service evaluation. Okay. So, the service evaluation, in terms of the quality of the service, I am evaluating the contractor or the freelancer as a service provider, and I'm evaluating the quality and sometimes also the quantity if there is a certain number of things to do, right? Um, from this perspective. And it's usually, it falls into the same category as vendor management, for example, right? So I don't put it in as an HR process to conduct exactly within the same time frame, the same way, right? As employees, absolutely not. But it's part of managing a relationship with a vendor. And then we have the service evaluation. We have sheets, definitely, right? Where we have the expectations very clearly listed, if that has been delivered in a timely manner to the satisfaction of the client, right? Does the other party have anything to say about it as well, right? So it's all about the quality of the services, not about the performance of an individual per se, as we would do it with employees. So it's a completely different process. It's very possible to set it up. But as I'm saying, it falls into the category of vendor management, not HR, not people processes. Although at the end of the day, it gives us not only transparency within the relationship, but also sometimes when we unfortunately talk about termination of these services, then it gives us the transparency for both sides, like what's happening, right? And why the expectations haven't been met. So I think for the sake of a good relationship and also, well, maintaining a good face of a brand, of an employer brand, although it's not an employer, of course, in that case, it's definitely good to have that transparency set up front.
Perfect. Nadia, thank you very much for sharing your experience with us. It was super, super valuable. This is almost like an encyclopedia of how to engage your contractors in a compliant way, which is great, and I think it's super useful for our audience. Thank you very much for your time today, and it was great having you here
Thanks a
speaking to
lot.
us.
Thanks a lot. It's been a great pleasure. Really appreciate it.